At first glance, this probably looks like a simple React component. You have the component, some props, a couple hooks that you're using, and then you're returning some state down here. As you can see, you can increment the state, the props, and so on, and everything works fine. But in actuality, there is no React at all in this application. Everything is entirely custom, and in this video, I'm going to show you how you can build your own custom React clone just like this. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this. Now to get started, we just have a really simple application setup. I have an index.html that is importing an index.js script, which we have right here. It's just completely blank. And then also we have a root, which is where we're going to mount our application, very similar to how you do with React. We also have a couple buttons here, one for incrementing the count and one for changing the prop that we're going to be passing into our component. And speaking of the component, I just have a shell of the component right here. You can see it works just like React. It's just a function that's taking in some props. In our case, we're passing in a prop count. And also we're going to have a count that we store as a state inside of our component. And we're also going to use memo to double our count as well. And then we're just outputting that state down here as a string. One important thing to note about this tutorial, though, is I'm not going to be tackling anything related to JSX. JSX is really related more so to React and how they render out HTML. In this video, we're just going to be dealing with text strings, but the JSX portion of React is really not the complicated portion because there's libraries you can use to render that. The complicated portion is how things like useState, useEffect, and useMemo actually work behind the scenes because they are much more complicated than they first appear, and it's really interesting to take a look at them because they cover a lot of really complex and important to understand JavaScript concepts. And also, if you have a project like this in your portfolio, it's really going to impress a lot of people because it's going to show them that you really understand JavaScript at a core level since these concepts are quite complex. Now, with that said, the very first and important thing that we need to worry about is making sure we can actually render out our component. And to do that, we need to create our own version of React, which we're going to call myreact.js, where all of our React-based code is going to go. We're going to create a function in here called render. This render function is going to take in a component. We're going to take in some props for that component. We're also going to take in a parent of where we want to render that component. And our component, as you can see here, is just a function. We call that function, passing in the props, and it returns to us a string output. So inside of here, we can say that our output is equal to calling component by passing in the props to that component. And then we have an output that we can actually put as our parent's text. So we can say parent.textContent is equal to our output. This is going to be by far the easiest and most simple portion of this video because it's just taking a function, calling it, and putting the output as the text content here. Super simple. Now in our index.js, let's import that render function we just created. And it's coming from /myreact.js. And then what we can do is we can just get the element we want and render it out to the screen. So let's just create a function for that. We're going to call it render component, just like that. And inside of here, we're just going to call that render function. We're going to pass in our component, which we're going to import. So we'll say import component. We want to import that from component.js. We're going to render our component. We're going to pass it in some props, and we know that we have a prop count. Let's just set that to 1, for example. And then we're going to come in here and we're going to render the parent, which is just document.getElementById of root. And that's because in our index.html, we have a root, which is going to be where we mount our application. So now if I just call that render component function and click save, you can see it's actually rendering out all the text for our component, and that prop that we're passing in with the text of 1 is being updated. So if we change it to 12, you can see it now has the value of 12. So our prop is properly being put into our component. The next thing I want to focus on is how we actually make our props change and to make sure our component updates properly. So to do that, we have this handy button right here, which has an ID of button prop for changing our prop. So we can just say document.getElementById of button prop. We want to add an event listener for when we click on that button. And whenever we click on that button, all we want to do is render our component, and just like that. And we also want to make sure we have this variable. We'll call it prop count starting at 0. And we just want to make sure we increment it by 1. So we'll say prop count plus plus, and in here we'll pass that prop count variable down. So it's going to start at 0, and if we click change prop, we're just incrementing it by 1 each time and re-rendering our component. That's pretty straightforward. Now this right here is pretty simple stuff, but the main reason we're implementing this is so that we can make sure that if we change the prop, for example, or we change our state, it still works with all of the props and everything else. So while this isn't like super complex React code, it's just there to make sure the rest of our code works as we expect. Speaking of the rest of our code, the most obvious thing to implement next is going to be state. So we want to have something like this where we say count and set count. is going to be equal to, and then we just want to come in here with a useState where we default our count to 0. This is going to be essentially what we want to create for useState, and we can make sure that we import useState, and that's going to come from /myreact.js. So we're going to create this useState function, and it should give us a count and a way to update that count as well. So in order to see if this works, let's go into myreact.js, and we're going to create that function. We're going to export a function called useState, and inside of here, we're going to have our initial state, and then we're going to have our useState function, and somewhere at the bottom, we're essentially going to return to it the state and the set state, but we don't really know what those are yet. And at first you may think, okay, this doesn't seem that hard to do. I'm just going to save our state in a variable, and then I'm going to have an update function, and then I'm going to return the state, and I'll update the state when I call the update function. But the part where this gets complicated is that you just essentially have a function you're calling, and you want that function to save some type of global state for you. But it's difficult to know where this function's being called and what order it's being called in and all of that. So there's some important rules about hooks we need to understand. And the main rule about hooks is that they always must be called in order from top to bottom. They can never change order, and they must be called every time the component renders. With that information, we always know that the first useState call is going to be for this count here. If we create a second useState call for something else, we know it's going to be for that new thing, and so on, because they have different orders. The first one is always going to be this one. The second one is always going to be this one, and so on. So we can use that to actually store information about each hook that we call. So what I want to do instead of myreact.js is essentially create an ID that we're going to use to assign for each piece of our state. And then whenever we render a component, we're going to reset our ID to 0. That way we always have a brand new ID to work with. So we'll just come in here. We're going to say ID is equal to 0. I'm actually just going to call this our global ID because this is a global variable inside of our component. Then down here, what I want to do is I want to make sure that we take our global ID. We want to reset it to 0 every single time that we finish rendering a component. That way the next component is going to have the correct ID being shown. Now, the next important thing that we need to worry about is going to be where do we store this state? And again, we're going to do this inside of a global variable. We're just going to call this component state, and it's going to be equal to a new map. And the reason we're using a map is because it's a perfect way to go from one value to another value. And if you're unfamiliar with maps, I have a full video on them linked in the cards and description for you. We're just going to have a new empty map to start with. And then when we are rendering out our component, before we do that, we want to see, hey, do we have any values for this map for our component? And instead of mapping to our particular component, what we're going to do is we're going to use our parent as the key for our map. That's because you can only ever put a component inside of a parent once. A parent cannot have multiple components inside of it. That's because inside of our render function, you can see we're overwriting the text content of our parent. So if you have two components being rendered in the same parent, the last one is always going to override the first one. So we know that our parent key is always going to be unique. We're only ever rendering into a parent one single time. So what we can do is we can say, okay, we have our component state. I want to call get, I want to pass in the parent. So for this particular parent, what is all the state for my component? And that right here is just going to be our state. Now, if we don't have any state, I just want to default this to a new object, which is going to have a cache that is an empty array. And this cache is where we're going to store all the information for each individual hook. The reason we made this an array is because our ID starts out at 0. So the first entry in the array is the first time we call a function. Then we increment our ID by 1. So the second time we call the function, it's going to be the second entry inside of our cache and so on. So for each parent that we're rendering into, we have a cache of information that we're storing inside of this state here. Now, the next thing I want to do is to be able to update our state. So we can just say component state.set. For our parent, I want to set an object that takes in our current state, and it's also going to pass in our component and our props. And the reason for this is I want to make sure this cache stays the same between every single render. I never want to change our cache, which is what this state is doing here. But we want to make sure that we update our component variable and our props variable in case, for example, our parent gets a new component rendered inside of it, or if we change the props we pass, we want to make sure those get updated inside of our state every single time we render the component. So when we click this change prop button, it is going to update this props variable right here for us. Now with that all done, all we've done is essentially create a component state that has a cache for information for our hooks, as well as a component and props that we can use inside of the hooks as needed. And now if we save, and instead let's just return initial state, we're just going to return a function that currently does nothing just to see if this works. And we save, we can see we have our state here, our prop is working. And if we just do a quick console log of our component state, we click save, inspect our page, go over to our console, you can see we have a map with one entry. That entry is our parent. And that is just an object which has a value which is our cache, our component, as well as our props. And as we change our prop, when we dive into this, you can see that our value for our props has changed. Now the prop count is 5, as you can see. So it's properly updating all the information we want inside of this global store. And this component state is essentially like our global state for all of our different components. So our useStates, our useEffects, useMemos, and so on are all going to store their information inside of here. And that's how we're going to be able to access information between different renders of the function that's going on. It's pretty complicated, but I'll try to explain it the best that I can. So now let's actually implement this useState function. So instead of useState, we need to be able to access the correct piece of component state for the correct parent. So we need to say like get parent, but we don't have access to the parent variable inside of our useState. So again, we need a global variable for that. We can say global parent, and then down here where we're setting our information, we can just make sure that we set our global parent equal to the parent variable being passed in. Now we have access to the correct parent variable. So inside of here, we can just say global parent. That's going to actually get us the information for that particular parent. And again, if I just inspect the page real quick, go to the console, you can see it's giving us the object that has the cache component and props for the actual parent that we are rendering. If I change our prop, you can see that it's properly updating our count here. So now with that, we actually have access to all the cache and component information we need inside of our state. So what we can do is we can actually create the implementation for our useState hook. The first thing I want to worry about is what happens when we don't have any state. Let's just come in here. We're going to get our cache information because that's the thing that we really care about. We're going to get that from our component state. So now we have our cache, and we also have our ID coming from that global ID. So we can get the actual cache itself by just saying, we'll say let, or actually const ID equals global ID, just like that. And now the actual individual cache for this state is just going to be the ID that is our global ID. And at the very end, we just want to make sure we take our global ID and just increment it by 1. And that's because after each hook is running, we just increment our ID by 1. That way, the next time we call useState, our ID will be 1 larger, so it'll be the next entry in our cache. Now what we can do is we can say, hey, do we have a value in our cache for the current ID? So if the cache for our ID is equal to null, then that means this is the first time we've ever called this useState hook. So we want to use our initial state. So we can say that our cache for our ID here is going to be equal to a new object, which has a value property. And we're just defining this arbitrarily. I just want to be able to store the value for our state somehow. So we'll use this value property. And we want to check if our initial state, the type of it, is equal to a function. And that's because inside of JavaScript, instead of React, with useState, you can pass it a function or you can pass it a value. So if it's a function, we're going to call it as a function. So we'll say initial state, call it as a function. Otherwise, what we're just going to do is pass it the initial state because that means it's some type of value, like a 0, for example. So now this is setting up our initial value for our cache. The next thing we want to do is just be able to render out that cache to the user. So instead of passing our initial state, we're just going to pass our cache of the ID into here. Now the final thing to do is to create that setState function. We'll call it setState, and this setState function is just going to be an arrow function which takes a state. And this state is going to be either a function or a value because setState can take both of them. So what we want to do is we just want to say if the type of state is equal to a function, then we're going to call the function version of it. So we'll just say that our cache of the ID, the value of that is going to be equal to calling state. We want to make sure we pass it our previous value because that's how the function version of setState works in React. We're passing it our previous value of our cache into this function and we're getting a new value out. Otherwise, if we just pass it a value such as 0, well, we can just take our cache ID dot value and set it equal to the state that's being passed in by setState. And then down here, we can render out that setState function. So now we have a setState function and we have our cache ID here. One problem though that we're going to run into is that we're never re-rendering our component when the state changes. Down here, we need to call that render function. And we need to pass it our component. We need to pass it in our props. And we need to pass it in the parent as well, because those are the things that we pass into here to render our component. So our parent is pretty easy. That is going to be our global parent. Our props is going to be coming from our cache up here. And we're going to have our component, which is coming from our cache as well. That's going to allow us to re-render our component when our state changes. And that right there should be all we need to do to make this setState work. We just want to make sure down here, we're getting the value from our cache. If we save, you can see our state is being populated as 0 right here. We go into our component, we change this to 10. You can see it renders out 10. We can make it a function version and it's still rendering out 10, change it to 13. So all of that is working fine. Now we just want to see if this set count is working as well. A really hacky way we can do this before we actually have anything like useEffects is we can just say set timeout. And inside of here, I just want to set a timeout that's going to be for, let's just do 1 second. And we're just going to call set count. And we're going to pass it in the value of 10. So after 1 second, the value should update to 10. So if we save, wait a second, you see the value updated to 10. Now, if we change this to use the previous version of our count, so we could say current count, we just say current count plus 1. Now what's happening is we're incrementing our count by 1 every second. So if we save, you can see it starts out at 0, then 1, then 2, then 3. And if we inspect our page, you should notice we don't have any errors. This is actually working as we expected to re-render in our component each time, which is great. Now, one thing to watch out for, though, is that we may run into issues if we try to render multiple of the same component at the same time. So if we come in here and we just double up our render, we put it in a different root, and inside of here, we just create ourselves a simple root 2. We save both of these. You're going to notice something interesting. Only the bottom one is updating, and it's actually updating twice. The top one's not even updating at all. And if we inspect, you'll notice we shouldn't have any errors, so there's no errors going on. But the reason for this is that inside of our React here, we just have a bunch of information in the global scope. So the first time that we call useState, it's going to be for our first component, and it's setting the parent to root 1. The second time we call it, we update our global parent to root 2. And that global parent stays as root 2. So we have the wrong global parent being used for our component when we're going to set the state. That is definitely not something that we want. In order to get around this issue, we can actually use something really tricky, which is essentially closures to scope information. So that way it's going to save the information at the time that we call useState instead of using the current global parent like we are right now. So to do that, essentially we just want to create a closure. And a closure is going to be a function that contains information inside of it. So we're going to return a function from this function and then call it immediately. We're using an immediately invoked function expression. So we're just going to create a function. And we're also going to immediately invoke this function. So to do that, you just wrap your function in parentheses like this, and then add 2 parentheses at the end. This is going to call a function immediately and return its result. So what we want to do is just put all the code that we currently have inside of this function. We can take this global ID incrementer and put it out here. Then we can create a variable called parent, set it equal to our global parent, just like this. And now anywhere that we used global parent, just change it to parent. Now what's happening is we're creating this variable called parent, which is scoped inside of useState. Then we're creating essentially this closure inside of useState. So what's going to happen is whenever we run this function, which happens immediately, it's going to save the value of what parent is and is never going to update it. So if global parent changes 100 times, it doesn't matter. This parent is always going to be the exact same value. It's not going to change. Now if I save this, you notice our states are updating simultaneously at the same time, which is exactly what we want. We can change our prop. You can see our props are updating, but now you'll notice some really crazy stuff is going on when we try changing our props. And that's because our set state here doesn't have the most up-to-date prop and component information. So in order to make sure we have the correct information inside of here, what we want to do is just cut this information. So we only have our cache inside of here. And down here, we want to get the information for our props and for our component every single time we call set state, since we want to have the most up-to-date information. And again, this is because of closures. When we had the information out here, it was accessing the information, saving it, and never updating it, even though we were inside this function. We want to make sure we get the most up-to-date props and component every single time, so we're going to make sure we get them every time we call set state. So now our count is incrementing properly, and if we change our prop, you're noticing that it changed the prop, and the prop itself is not getting messed up. Now our state is a little bit messed up, and that's because we're re-rendering our component a bunch of times, which is causing us to have a bunch of set timeouts, which is exactly where useEffect comes in, so let's implement that now. Let's just get rid of the set timeout that we have inside of here. We don't really care about this. Instead, what we want to do is we want to pass it in a button element. So we'll just call it button elem. And that's going to be this button right here for incrementing our count. What we want to do is we want to call useEffect, and essentially we just want to hook up an event listener. So we'll say handler is going to be equal to a function, and this function is just going to call set count. We're going to take in our current count, and it's going to increment it by 1, just like that. And then we can take our button elem, we can add an event listener on click. We just want to use that handler, just like that. And then an important thing about useEffect is whatever you return from it is going to be a function that we run on cleanup. So we want to make sure we remove this event listener on cleanup. We'll just come in here, and we're going to say button elem.remove event listener, and we're going to remove the click event listener for the handler that we just created. Make sure I spell that properly. There we go. So we're adding our event listener, and then we're removing it at the end when we no longer need it. And then we can also pass an array of dependencies inside of here. So for example, our button element is a dependency for this useEffect right here. We don't need to worry about passing setCount as a dependency though, and that's because inside of React, this is a rule. You don't have to worry about these functions being dependencies. So we're going to make sure we implement that as well in our own version of React. So first things first, let's pass that button element into our component. First, I want to create a second button. We're going to have button count and button count 2. That way we have two separate buttons, one for incrementing the top, one for incrementing the bottom. And in here, let's just make sure we import useEffect like this. And inside of here, we're just going to export a function called useEffect. And for now, we're just not going to worry about anything with this function. It's just going to do nothing, just so we have it being exported so it can be used. In our index, here, let's pass in our button element, which is just button L, as document.getElement by ID. And we called this, let's see here, button count. So we'll say button count. This is going to be for the second button count. And then we're also going to have our button passed up into here. And it's going to be button count without a number at the end of it. So now both of our components have this button element being passed to them. So now with that all done, we can finally actually work on implementing this useEffect hook. And I'm actually going to copy a lot of the code from our useState hook because it's going to be pretty similar. Actually, there's a lot of similarities between the two. So we're going to get our ID and our parent, and we're going to increment our global ID. That's obviously the most important thing we're going to do. And interesting, you'll notice the global ID is shared between useState, useEffect. It doesn't matter. All we care is that our hooks are always in the same order. So useState is going to be an index of 0 because it's the first one. useEffect is second, so the index is going to be 1. That's really all that matters. So inside of our cache, it's going to be an ID of 1 when we call this on our first component. Now here, instead of storing a value inside of our cache, we're going to be storing an array of dependencies. We're going to say our dependencies here is going to be equal to undefined the very first time that we call our cache. Because if our cache is empty, it means we've never called this useEffect before. So we're going to make sure our dependencies start out undefined. Instead of our useEffect, this is going to take in a callback as well as an array of dependencies. We're going to have a callback and dependencies. Then what we want to do down here, instead of creating this set state, we instead want to check, hey, have our dependencies changed at all? So we can just say const dependencies changed going to be equal to, and we want to check to see, hey, are our dependencies not defined? Are they null or undefined? If so, okay, that means that they've changed. The reason for this is because in React, we go over to our component, we can actually pass nothing into our useEffect, and that means our useEffect should run every single time our component changes. So if we pass in nothing, then we want to essentially say our dependencies changed, because if they changed, we'll re-render and do our useEffect. Otherwise, we won't do anything. So if our dependencies is null, which means we don't have any dependencies, let's make sure we emulate this as if it changed. Otherwise, if it's not null, then we can come in here and we can check, hey, okay, now do we have any changes? So to do that, we can just take our dependencies and we can check, hey, are some of our dependencies different from the previous dependency? So for each dependency and each index, what we want to do is we want to come in here, we want to do a simple return, and we just want to first check to see if our cache has dependencies. So if our cache ID dependencies is equal to null, that means it's our first render essentially. So if our dependencies here is null, that'll be our first render. Then what we're going to do is say, hey, they've changed. Because on the first render, we always want to make sure that we say that things have changed. That's just something in React. Whenever you do the first render, it's going to run your useEffect. Then the next thing that we need to do is check for, or is the dependency different at that index? So we can say cache ID dependencies at the index, is that different than the actual dependency that we have? So if it's not the same as the dependency that we're looping through, then we know there's a difference. Let's just make this a little wider so we can see exactly what's going on. Throw in my parentheses where they belong. And let's make sure we also include this function being called down here. So when we save, you can see it's reformatted our code for us. As you can see, our dependencies changed variable essentially says, is the dependencies we pass in null? If so, always re-render. So always pretend they changed. Otherwise, check to see if some of our dependencies are different. If there are no dependencies yet in the cache, that means it's the first time we're running the component, so pretend that it changed. Otherwise, if there are dependencies, check to see if any of them are different than the current dependency at that index. So if they're different at all, any of them, even just one, then the dependencies have changed. Then if the dependencies have changed, we call our callback. So if dependencies changed, then what we want to do is we want to call our callback. So that's pretty simple. We can just say callback. And it's important to note that we're going to get a cleanup value from this. So we can say that in our cache, at this particular ID, we want to take the cleanup, we want to set it equal to the return of our callback. And this is just a function we call. And if you remember, that's because in here we return a function. That's the function we clean up before we call our callback. So here, if our cache ID.cleanup is not equal to null. So if we have a cleanup value, then obviously we want to call that. So we're going to say hash id dot cleanup. We're going to call that as a function. So first, try to clean everything up if we have a cleanup value, then take our callback and whatever it returns, save it as the cleanup value. And then finally, what I want to do is update our dependencies because they have changed. So we're going to take our id.dependencies and set them equal to the dependencies that are being passed in to our function all the way up here. And then down here, we don't have to worry about returning anything because this doesn't actually return anything. So we can just get rid of all of the returns here. So we've written a lot of code, but let's see if it works at all. Let's click here, increment count. You can see that's working properly. Increment down here is working properly. When we change our prop, that's working properly. So everything is working as we expect. And if we inspect, we should hopefully have no errors. As you can see in our console, we have no errors at all. And our code over here looks just like React code. We have a useEffect, we have a useState, and they're working exactly as we want them to. Now I'm just going to kind of refresh exactly what's going on in this useEffect so you understand it. We're just checking here first. Is this the first time we call useEffect? If so, initialize everything to undefined. Then have the dependencies changed from what we passed in here. So is the new dependencies different than our old dependencies? If so, make sure that we call the cleanup function to clean everything up, then call the callback and save our new cleanup and update our dependencies because they have changed. That's all there is to this useEffect. It's pretty simple code, but the actual concepts around closures and scoping are pretty complex to make all of it work. Now the final hook that I want to cover is going to be the useMemo hook. So in our component, we have this prop count doubled. I just want to set that to calling useMemo. And inside of this useMemo, we're going to pass our dependencies, which in our case is just our prop count. It works very similar to useEffect. And then inside of here, I just want to return prop count times 2. And I'm also going to put a simple console.log that says in memo. That's because this memo should only get called when our prop count has changed. So it doesn't matter how many times our state changes, we shouldn't call useMemo unless we change our prop. This is going to be essentially our test to make sure this works. So right now, obviously we don't have a useMemo, so let's make sure we create one. I'm actually going to copy useEffect because useMemo and useEffect share a lot of the same things. They have a callback and they have dependencies, and we want to set everything to default by the start. So our dependencies is going to be undefined at the beginning. We're going to check to see if our dependencies changed exactly the same. The only difference is going to be down here what happens when our dependencies change. We don't have a cleanup, so we don't care about that. And instead of having a cleanup get returned, we have an individual value being returned. And then we need to make sure we return our cache id.value down here and return the result of this IIFE. That's the only differences between useMemo and useEffect. Instead of saving a cleanup, we're saving a value because in here we're returning a value. And then we're returning that value to make sure we can use it inside of our component. So increment count, change prop, all of those are working and we're getting our doubled prop here. The real test is going to be when we inspect our console to see how many times we get the in-memo being logged. When we change our prop, you notice in-memo gets logged twice. That's because we have our component being rendered twice, so each one is logging it once. But when we change our count here, you notice in-memo doesn't ever get logged. That's because we're not changing our prop, but as soon as we change our prop, it starts logging out that text. So it's only ever calling the function inside of useMemo whenever our dependencies change, which is exactly how useMemo should work. Now I'll admit this is not an easy video to understand because there's a lot of complex JavaScript concepts going on, but if you want to really learn those JavaScript concepts and master JavaScript, I highly recommend checking out my full JavaScript simplified course. I'll link down in the description below because we cover all the information you need to know in order to actually create this yourself. That said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.